Today, I have the great honor of introducing to you Ainley Cronin, who's a very dear teacher and a friend, and who's been showing me how to do what all writing requires to varying degrees, which is jumping into the unknown. For me, this was the scariest part always, stepping into this wood of your own thoughts and knowing that a path will emerge. She's teaching me to get out of my own way, to put away this fear of criticism from myself and from others, and to trust that the inner voice will find its way. She uses a combination of the Amherst writers and artists methods, along with her own pedagogy, and guides her students in tapping into a reservoir of connections and insights that they usually don't even know existed themselves. So it's a great process of discovery. Ainley is a brilliant writer herself. Her writing has appeared in many, many journals. Some of the key ones I'll tell you are the Big Muddy, the White Wall Review, the Ignatian Literary Magazine, The Courage to Heal, and The Magic of Memoir. She has won many awards and accolades. Among them, she was a winner of the Eastern Iowa Review's Lyric Essay Contest, I believe in 2018, I'm sorry if I got the year wrong, and a finalist for the Fish Anthology. Ainley has received a literary residency at the Word Space Studio in San Francisco this year, and she leads writing workshops in the Bay Area, which I'm privileged to attend. So enough hearing about Ainley, here's Ainley herself.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Vibha. That was quite the introduction. I have large shoes to now fill. And thank you so much, Jerry, for making it possible for me to speak here today. I really spent a lot of time getting ready for this in typical writer fashion. I procrastinated first, which is every writer's first tool, which is to procrastinate. And why to today, what you can put off till tomorrow. But then when tomorrow comes and tomorrow is the day you're speaking, it starts to get a little more frightening. But I also really went into this process of recognizing as I was getting ready to share with you much about what I'm going to talk about today, which is the creative impulse and the courage to trust it. I really entered myself into the very arena that I share with my writers, which is what happens to us when we are actually landing ourselves into that creative impulse and what is required of us in order to trust how we maneuver where we find ourselves, even by just having that creative impulse alone. And so what I want to do is just take you on a bit of a journey. And if it's okay, Vibha, I'm going to share my screen. And I'm going to move you through just a bit of a slideshow here. And can you see that, Vibha? Is that visible on your end? Perfect. And so as I was thinking about this, because I'm originally from Ireland, I wanted to bring you in to the very nature of where creativity comes from in us. Because I think for so many of us, I think we forget that we are all born with this creative impulse. And that for so many of us, we enter into this process of slow forgetting. And when we start to forget, we assume that this forgetting is because we don't naturally have this inherent storytelling gift. And so for me, what I wanted to start with, because this is where I always begin with words, because this is where my own love of the creative impulse began. And I started looking at the Irish word for create, which is crathú. And the whole word, the verb to create, comes from a noun, to make, or the form of something, the make of something, the appearance, the figure, the shape. And then I came across this word, metamorphose, right there in the middle of create, in terms of what it is that the Irish word embodies, that the Irish word for create, which is crathú, embodies the notion of metamorphosis. And I thought, there it is. There's what the creative impulse is right there. It's this thing that is born in all of us, which is consciousness itself, longing for expression, consciousness itself, constantly moving and changing in us, as us, and through us. And then interestingly, the word for impulse in Irish is spraga, which is almost onomatopoeic in a way. And spraga means this thing that of itself announces itself. And it's almost as though it's the formless announcing its form because it is so longing to become. And so for me, when I put those two together, I realized this is so much of what we do as writers, is that we are dropping into that creative impulse and we are trying to make of the formless a form. And when I realized, oh my goodness, this is so much of where we get caught up, I also began to realize that if the impulse to create is this natural innate impulse in all of us, which is storytelling, because all of us are born with the shape of story within us. It's part of how we come into this world. We come into this world and there's a story that we are going to live out for however long or short we are in the world. And there's also the story of creation itself that is constantly happening with every in-breath and every out-breath. And that if to create is to be the storyteller, then the courage to trust that impulse is the courage to trust the story that's coming through us. And so for me, this is very much a story about the storyteller and the story. And so as I was thinking about that, I began to think about where I come from. And I come from a nation of storytellers and a nation of silence. And let me explain. So when I was growing up, I was kind of in the middle generation between the generations of Irish people that had been storytelling as part of their nightly entertainment, part of how their whole culture held itself together was through storytelling. It was innate, it was part of the storytelling environment, it was part of who we were, it was part of the atmosphere we moved through. And when I was about 3 or 4, I began to just naturally embody this creative impulse because we do as children. We want to tell stories. All you have to do is look on YouTube and you'll find toddlers who are just longing to babble, whatever it is that they have picked up from the environment of raw materials. And I began to think of my own journey with storytelling. And when I was 3 or 4, how I would love to be plopped up on the kitchen table. And my older sisters loved doing this. They plopped me on the kitchen table and there would be a line of visitors on the couch across the way with their cups of tea and their saucers and dunking their biscuits and waiting to see what would come out. And this was a very natural part of the Irish kitchen atmosphere. When visitors came, you were expected to entertain them. And usually the children were lined up in the hall with the coats and they came in one by one to show off what they were able to do, dancing, singing, whatever. And I was plopped up on the kitchen table and I would start to tell stories. And at 3 and at 4, I had that creative impulse to storytell. Now, I didn't have the finesse to put the story together in its components in the proper way. So I didn't know anything about Chekhov's gun. I didn't know that if you introduced an element in the first couple of scenes, that you'd better have the gun go off towards the end of the story. I didn't know any of that. All I knew was that I wanted to tell stories. And I would draw components from whatever it is I had gathered of found pieces and overheard pieces that I had heard from other people in my environment. And so for me, where does the silence come in? Well, I was part of a disappearing culture. I was part of a disappearing language. I was part of a disappearing people, a disappearing tradition, because Irish language was on the wane. And as it was on the wane, something of the aliveness of our storytelling, of our creative impulse was also leaving us. And then for me, as a girl in that culture, there was a whole other story of disappearing that was happening, which was the story of my disappearing as a girl in that culture, which is its own specific story and very much has to do with growing up in a patriarchal environment, growing up within the Catholic Church, and growing up within a culture that could not take responsibility for its own sins. And so for me, at the age of about 4 or 5, I came in contact with the darker side of my own culture and came in contact with what it was to become part of the disappeared in my own lived skin as a girl who was being abused and had no access to language for that. And when I lost access to the language for that lived story, I also lost access to that creative impulse in me that loved storytelling and that loved story. Now, they didn't go away. They just got buried way down in a place where I felt I couldn't even feel them anymore. But what was still going on around me and pulsating and trying to stay alive was this nation of storytelling. And I want to tell you about one storyteller in particular. And this was a storyteller who lived in the next peninsula over from mine. And this storyteller, Peg Sayers was her name, was a storyteller that I grew up around hearing about. She died in 1958. And the beautiful thing about this particular storyteller was that Peg Sayers was illiterate in her own native tongue. This was part of the disappearing that was happening. She could not read and could not write in Irish, but she could read and she could write in English up to grade maybe 5, because that was the only education available in the turn of the 20th century was in the English language. But the Irish people weren't being educated in their own native tongue, but they were still speaking it. And so Peg was this incredible storyteller who, by the time the 1930s came around, professors from Dublin began to realize that there was something happening on the southwestern tips of Ireland, which is where I come from, which was where storytelling was still alive, and that they had better capture it in case it disappeared. And so for them, what they started to do was they started to log what these storytellers were telling. And they logged from Peg Sayers, excuse me, who was illiterate in her own tongue. They logged 5,000 pages of stories that she had carried around with her. This is a woman who couldn't read or couldn't write in her own language and was carrying around 5,000 pages because the storytelling was alive in her and the stories were alive in her and were part of her. And so it's really quite incredible. And I'm not sure how I make this, let me see, because I want to be able to see. So here's the quote itself. I wish I had the ability to describe the scene in Peg Sayers' home in Dunquin on a winter's night when the stage was set for the Shanachie. The Shanachie was the Irish storyteller, writes Joseph O'Dowling to me, who's the man who was collecting this. When the visitors arrived, for all gathered to the Sayers' house when Peg was there to listen to her from supper time till midnight. The chairs were moved back and the circle increased, news was swapped, and the news often gave the lead for the night's subject, death, fairies, weather, crops. All was grist to the mill, the sayings of the dead and the doings of the living, and Peg, as she warmed to her subject, would illustrate it richly from her repertoire of verse, proverb, and story. Great artist and wise woman that she was, Peg would at once switch from gravity to gaiety, for she was a light-hearted woman, and her changes of mood and face were like the changes of running water. As she talked, her hands would be working too, a little clap of her palms to cap a phrase, a flash of the thumb over the shoulder to mark a mystery, a hand hushed to mouth for mischief or whispered secrecy. And when the fun was at its height, it's time to go, runs the Irish proverb. And when visitors went each night, Peg would draw the ashes over the peat embers to preserve the fire till morning, reciting her customary prayer, I preserve the fire as Christ preserves all, Bridget at the two ends of the house and Mary in the center, the three angels and the three apostles who are highest in the kingdom of grace, guiding the house and its contents until day. The reason I wanted to share this with you is that Peg Sayers, she was really a phenomenon for me to follow and to understand, because she was a phenomenon of both the storytelling and she was also a phenomenon of the story itself. And as you can see from the description of those who witnessed her, the storytelling and the story were inseparable from one another in terms of how her lived experience of both expressed through her. Here's the odd part for me as I was thinking about this talk. I was thinking about the fact that Peg was illiterate in her own native tongue, in terms of she couldn't write it, she couldn't read it, and yet she has left behind a tome, because what she had contact with was beyond reading and writing. She had contact with the creative impulse that was alive in her, and was alive in her to the degree that when the professors came down again towards the end of her life and said to her, listen, we'd love to hear your story, she was able to deliver them her lived story in Irish from start to finish. And she was able to give them the arc of a story, which would now be classified as a memoir. And she did that from memory as well. And when I went to convent boarding school in the same vicinity where Peg had been born and reared and passed away, I was moving through that atmosphere. I was moving through the atmosphere of the storytelling. I was moving through the atmosphere of what it was that Irish people, despite how much had disappeared, what they still had access to of storytelling and story. And one of the very first things that I came in contact with when I went to this all Irish speaking convent boarding school, where we were being retrained to come back into our native tongue. And when I went into the convent gates, through those convent gates at 12 years old, I was told, you will not be speaking English anymore. All you will be speaking now is Irish. And one of the first tomes I came in contact with was Peg's book, the book of her life. And we were asked to memorize long passages. And I'll never forget the first sentence. It was, is Shanavan mish anish, le cusawan sanoigus and cusa ela era avroch. I am an old woman now with one foot in the grave and the other foot on its brim. And right there was everything you needed to know about storytelling. A narrator who was letting you know straight away, I'm a retrospective narrator, so I'm going to be looking back and I don't have time to waste. And I also have a love of language because there's assonance and alliteration and musicality in that very first sentence. And from there on, her story just oozes all of the things that became part of her creative impulse, which is that language lives in us, story lives in us, image lives in us, metaphor, and from all that lived association, if we let it loose, if you let loose the creative mind and the creative impulse to tell its own stories with its own natural God-given storytelling ability, what you're doing is you're liberating the association. From association comes imagery, from imagery comes metaphor, from metaphor comes meaning, and from meaning comes story, and you're back at that beautiful beginning again. And so, with all of this beautiful storytelling and all of the ways of having that be part of the atmosphere, the weather through which I moved, and part of that being the weather that I want to pass along to you, along with this beautiful good weather that we have in California. Thank God I didn't bring the Irish weather with me. But along with all of that, I also want to share with you what it is to not just be to come from a nation of storytellers, but to come from a nation of silence. Because how does that happen? How does that happen if you come from a nation of storytellers, that you also come from a nation of people who have forgotten their stories? How can those two live together? And here's the beauty, that any good story, we all know this has tension. And where does the tension come from? It comes from contrast. It comes from an abundance of one thing and a dearth of something else. It comes from something being beautiful and something being ugly. And my life was no different. My childhood was no different. And so for me, I listened to Colm Tóibín back at the Berkeley Book Festival several years ago, and he said something that kind of startled me. Someone asked him, listen, what does it feel like to come from a nation of storytellers? And he said, you know, we actually don't. We come from a nation of silence, of people who actually don't tell their stories. And I was sitting in the back row and I got very startled, and I was like, wow, is he supposed to say that? And I almost felt like he'd let down the side. I was like, jeepers, aren't we? Do you know, don't we have little enough to be boasting about that we're going to get this taken away from us too? And then I realized, you know what? I live this every day. What am I talking about? I live this lived experience of silence, of knowing what this is about, because I grew up in a culture that also shut the door on certain stories. And the stories that they shut the door on, a lot of the time, were the stories of the truths that we had lived, either ourselves historically, dare you say, in the Irish culture to people when I was growing up, that we were a post-traumatic culture, that we were a damaged culture, that we were a dysfunctional culture, that we were a culture who had a lot of alcoholism running through us. And they really, really bristled at being generalized about in that way. But more than that, they generalized at having anyone pull up the corner of the rug on some of the stories that people had just shoved down. And so by the time I got to be in my mid-20s, all of those untold stories in me kept clashing with this creative impulse that was still alive in me. Now, the creative impulse had never left me since childhood. And if this is the one thing you carry away, then that's a gift. That's a success for me, that I want to let you know that the creative impulse never, ever goes away from us, nor do our stories ever abandon us or leave us, but they come back to us to the degree that we bring our attention there, that we bring our awareness there, that we bring our affection there, and that we bring our love back there to ourselves, to our own lived stories, to our own lived experiences, and to our natural God-given right to be storytellers for our own lives. We don't have to tell somebody else's story in their way. We come to tell the story that we have come to tell in our own way, in our unique way. So if the story has been silenced, and that's what we're bringing back, the storyteller has also lost their voice. And that's also what I'm bringing back. That's what I hope to bring back when I speak to people in my classes, when I speak in general. Usually the thing that I'm trying to do is to bring back to life the embers of things that people have forgotten or that people have left by the wayside. So how did this come to pass for me? How did I go from being this person that came from a storytelling culture, but also came from a nation of silence? And where did all of this transition into me being who I am today? Well, it actually transitioned with one word, believe it or not. And that one word was that in my mid-20s, I had the audacity to say the one word in my small Irish Catholic village that instantly and overnight made of me a stranger and an exile. And that one word was lesbian. I had the audacity to say, listen, there's one true story about myself, and I think that might be the story that sets me free. I knew there was something that was wanting to get out, and I wanted to give it a word. Now, of course, it was very idealistic of me to think that one word would set me free, but it actually wasn't, because one word can set you free, because a word after a word after a word is power. That's Margaret Atwood. A word after a word after a word is power, and it is power. And sometimes we start with that first word because it's the best word we know. And that was the best word I knew. And when I said that word, I did not know that the word that was going to be a prayer for me was going to be poison for everybody else. And it was. And so overnight, I packed up my life, packed up everything I owned. I had gone back to the village of my childhood as a school teacher. I had been at boarding school. I had been trained for 5 years in boarding school, really to become a teacher of some kind or to become a speaker of some kind, because they trained us in the Irish language. They trained us in the English language. They trained us in French, so that we spent every weekend in that convent boarding school writing 3 essays every single weekend. You hit the ground running from the moment you walked through those convent doors. That first weekend, you were in study hall and you were writing an essay in Irish, an essay in English, and an essay in French. And you did this for that whole 5 years. But when I landed back in my small village as a teacher and spent some years there teaching, I realized this was not the life that I wanted to live. And all I knew was this creative impulse in me that was saying, there's something else, there's something else, there's something else. There's a storyteller in you that wants to tell a story, and this is not the story. This is not your lived story. This is not the story you're going to live for the rest of your life. How are you going to set yourself free? And I came upon this one word, lesbian. I used it, and overnight, my life finished. And I drove down that lane, that village lane, overnight, with everything I could squeeze into my small Ford Fiesta. When I came back the following week, The locks had been changed and people acted as though I was invisible. And so I drove down the road and I ended up coming to America, of course, the land of liberty, the land of freedom. Now, I had never thought in a million years I would come to America. My grandmother had been an American citizen before me. She had come over from Ireland, had spent many years here, and then had gone back. And when she'd gone back, she had refused to speak English ever again, had spoken Irish for the rest of her life. And I drove down the road and I didn't know really that America was going to be my destination and that I was going to follow in my grandmother's footsteps, but follow I did. And I ended up on the East Coast. And the woman who brought me over here, a dear friend of mine, and at the time, my first big love, had said to me, do you know what? You're a storyteller and you need to tell your stories and you need to write them down. And I thought, pish posh, that's rubbish. I'm not a storyteller. I don't have stories to tell. And she said, you really just need to go to a writing class. And so I went to my first writing class. And I didn't put it together until last night that the first writing class I went to for the Amherst Writers Method was in the year 2000, and it was in Amherst. Now, I don't know how that detail didn't strike me until last night. I was like, oh my God, you took your first Amherst Writers Artists Method class in Amherst. And here's where I came across this idea that the storyteller and the story had a chance after all. And when I went into that first class, I came across the principles of the Amherst Writers and Artists Method. And here were the principles. Everyone has a strong, unique voice. Everyone is born with creative genius. Writing belongs to all people. Teaching can be done without damage to a writer's original voice or self-esteem. In my own mind, I was like, oh, ask the nuns about that. And a writer is someone who writes. And in my own mind, I was like, I don't know if that's true. I really don't know if that could possibly be true. But I sat there that night and I was willing to believe, because one word had gotten me down the village lane. And I knew that there had to be other words that I would cobble together to try and create now for myself a new lived reality for my own life, in my own lived skin, in a new land, and in a whole new landscape. And so that night, I'll never forget it. The teacher, she read us a poem, and I couldn't find it last night, but I'm sure I'll come across it. And I have the notebooks in my big boxes of journals way back in my closet. And she read us a poem. And the poem was about a hummingbird. I'll always remember it because the hummingbird was just such this tiny little creature. And I thought, oh my God, this is such a beautiful poem. And something again came alive in me, that creative impulse that had never left me. The same creative impulse that had gotten me down the road, the same out of that village, the same creative impulse that had been in the child me sitting on the kitchen table, cobbling together stories, the same creative impulse that Peg Sayers spent a lifetime following, even though she couldn't read or write in her own native tongue. And so here was I with this thing pulsing inside me, listening to this poem, and the teacher saying to us, you know, you don't really need to do anything else except write what comes to you. And I thought, really? I had only been used to academic classes and formal classes. And I thought, oh my God, it couldn't be that simple. Really? Could it be that simple? And she said, honestly, just start writing. And so I started writing. And I was trying to think last night, and this is a kind of a facsimile of what I wrote that first night. She read the poem. I started to write. I hadn't written a true word about myself, and probably spoken a true word about myself, not really a true word, since I was 5 years old. And I started writing. Something beats inside my chest, something quiet, something not quite dead. Something flutters with each breath, something alive. That something is me. I swear I thought I had written a tome, and I had. I had written the first true words in what would turn out to be my native tongue, the native tongue of my truth. It wasn't Irish. And so for a long time, I thought that if I wasn't going to write in Irish, if I wasn't going to find my story in my native tongue, maybe I was never going to find my story. Come to find out that there is a native tongue for our story that lives inside in our own hearts. And what we have to do is have the courage to trust the creative impulse that says, here's a small little echo of it. Here's another small echo of it. And we jot down those words. So I spent the next 10 years taking writing classes. I took writing classes in the Amherst Writers and Artists Method. Now, I didn't know that night when I was sitting in this, she was a playwright, her name was Deborah, And I was sitting in her living room in Amherst. And I did not know that the founder of the AWA method, Pat Schneider, Lord have mercy in her soul, she passed away last year. I did not know that Pat Schneider was living somewhere in that town, also giving Amherst Writers and Artists method classes. And so I was right in the creative pulse of exactly where I was supposed to be. And all that took me there was one word down the village lane, which was lesbian, which was not enough to build a life on. I needed more than that. But look, it got me out. And then there were all these lovely words that I was cobbling together. And so over the next 10 years, I started cobbling other words together, went to writing class after writing class after writing class. And one of the things I started to learn, because I had teaching in my background, but now I also had trauma recovery, because I also started going to therapy, which of course, when I would say to certain people in Ireland, listen, I've started therapy, they'd be like, pish posh, there's nothing wrong with us. And I can't remember, was it, what's the name of that famous psychotherapist who said that the nation most impervious to psychotherapy was Irish people, because they had so much of a lid on everything. But I started going, and I realized as a teacher and as a writer, there was a whole other side to this setting free of the storyteller, that if I wanted to pass it along to the next person, because I was learning in recovery, in 12-step recovery, in trauma recovery, I was learning that in order to keep your recovery, what do? You give it away. And as a teacher, it was the same thing for me. I couldn't, once I learned something, I couldn't give it away fast enough. And so I started developing a technique of my own. And I knew that it had something to do with this creative impulse and bringing that alive in everybody around me. I was like, there's a way in which I want to create a map for everybody else too, because why does everybody else have to go through the hardship if I can even make it some bit simpler? And so I came up over the next 10 years. So I was 10 years studying and writing and in writing classes, and then another 10 years teaching and learning and finessing, and which of course in Irish traditional circles, they would then call you fit to become part of your professional landscape, because you've given your due diligence, you've given your 10,000 hours, you've spent your 10 or 20 years, being in that atmosphere of learning and of finessing your skills. And I realized that there was a kind of a 3-step model that I had taken. The first one was the permission to begin wherever we are, with whatever word, memory, or image comes to us. The second was the muscle memory to continue. That muscle memory, which started that first night in that AWA class, of the continuing, because that writer had said, just continue. Don't worry about it being right or wrong. Just put one word after another after another. The form will land later. And then it was the courage to complete what I had come to say. When I came to that last line, that something flutters with each breath, something alive, something in me, or that something is me, I knew I had come to the last line of what I wanted to say that night. But I knew that there was going to be many more iterations of that. And there were, and there are, and there will be until my last breath, please God. But the courage to complete what we have come to say, that there's no right or wrong way to capture a first draft. Honor what comes through, trust it will find its final meaning and its final form in revision. And so then I decided, now I need to actually make this a lived experience for writers when they come into my class. And so I thought, okay, where's the permission to begin? And here's where the permission to begin is. There's a vitality, a life force, an energy, a quickening that is translated through you into action. And because there's only one of you in all of time, this expression is unique. And if you block it, it will never exist through any other medium, and it will be lost. The world will not have it. It is not your business to determine how good it is, nor how valuable, nor how it compares with other expressions. It is your business to keep it yours clearly and directly. Keep the channel open. You do not even have to believe in yourself or your work. You have to keep yourself open. Keep the channel open. And I realized, here it is. Here's the channel. Here's the creative impulse. It's this thing that's alive inside of us. And I thought, well, let me bring it alive in every writer who comes through my doors. And if I can do that, I've done a good job with my life. And so I began to devise this meditation at the very beginning of my classes. And I thought, let them live this. And so I lead my writers, every class, I lead them through this meditation, where I bring them into the in-breath, and then I bring them into the out-breath. And I ask them to just come into the skin of their lived experience in the moment of the breath. And that whatever it is of busyness, to drop that knapsack of busyness at the door of their office, drop it, and to bring the mind back to the breath. And let the breath be the only focus. Because what happens when you start to just focus on the breath is you realize that the breath itself is story. And Buddhists say that at the cusp of each breath is spirit, is consciousness itself. And so consciousness itself is a longing for expression through us as a channel. And as I was thinking about this in this last couple of weeks, and as I was walking around my Alameda neighborhood, which I now walk and I mark as though it's my own territory, because everything for me is the way it was for Peg Sayers. Everything is a lived experience. Everything becomes part of the landscape of me as a storyteller and my story. And so everything becomes alive with that. The houses that I pass, the front gardens, the little nicks and knacks that they leave outside on the pavement. Everything for me is that. And so when I bring writers in, I'm saying, listen, when you're in breathing, you're taking in the raw materials of the world as you experience. There's a moment where the breath runs through the cusp of spirit itself, of consciousness itself, and then it comes back out into the out breath of form, of whatever it is the washboard of consciousness has created of information for that raw material, so that it comes back out in form and informed. And so this is story. We take in the raw material, we let it run through the channel of consciousness that is us, only us, and we allow it to come out again in form and informed. And sometimes this may take as many cycles as it takes for a story to find its actual form. We get so afraid because we are in the left brain that says logically, discursively, I have to find the form now. The creative brain, the imaginative brain, the intuitive brain, the associative brain, where image lives, where metaphor lives, where meaning lives, that's not living according to the linear, logical schedule that you have over here. It's saying, no, I have a story to tell. And if you just open up, I will tell you that story, but you have to trust me. You have to trust me. Oftentimes, I just drop into the channel because I don't know what it wants to say. But then I found that writers, and of course, here's the channel. The universe is made up of stories, not of atoms. So it's there for us. It's not as though there's any limit to the supply of story. Consciousness is unlimited, and our access to consciousness is also unlimited. And so what I had to figure out was, well, where do I give writers this muscle memory? I've given them the permission to trust that they are dipping into the well of consciousness itself that expresses through us, as us, in us, longing for expression. The spraga that I talked about in that Irish word, that impulse to come alive, formless, wanting to be formed, going, where can I take form next? Oh, please let it be me. Please let it be my turn. Consciousness longing for it everywhere. And I thought, okay, what's the muscle memory here? The muscle memory is this. First thoughts have tremendous energy. It's the way the mind first flashes on something. The internal sensor usually squelches them. So we live in the realm of second and third thoughts, thoughts on thought, twice and three times removed from the direct connection of the first fresh flash. You must be a great warrior when you contact first thoughts and write from them, especially at the beginning. You will feel great emotions and energy that will sweep you away, but you don't stop writing. You continue to use your pen and record the details of your life and penetrate into the heart of them, into the heart of them. This is the muscle. The muscle is knowing that those first thoughts are to be trusted. What happens to us is that and I'm going to use a very technical term here, shitbirds. that the shitbirds come in. Now, shitbirds is a term that Philip Schultz, he's a Pulitzer Prize winning poet from the East Coast, he coined that to describe our inner critics. And that whenever we sit down to create, who comes alive but the shitbirds? And so that we have to learn to live with these shitbirds and poo-poo them away. Because the first thoughts are the thoughts that have the tremendous energy. And Abigail Thomas talks about this in another talk that I listened to, where she says, those first drafts, you save them. You save them if you handwrite them, you save them if you type them out, because those first drafts have the creative impulse of the story itself, so that it doesn't matter after that how far you stray away while you're looking for form. Is this a lyric essay? Is this a prose poem? Is this going to be a piece of flash fiction? Is this going to be something longer? No matter how far you stray away, once you keep that first draft, you have the first fresh flash, and you have the creative impulse itself that's saying there's something here that's longing for expression, this formless that wants to come into form. And if you keep coming back to me, I'll reveal to you what I'm trying to say. And sometimes we have to have patience and sit in there. So then I realized, okay, so I'm asking the writers to sit into the heart of the matter. What are they experiencing? And I saw this time and again with myself and with others. Adrienne Rich says, the impulse to create begins often terribly and fearfully in a tunnel of silence. So now we're back to that silence and the untold story. And the idea that to open the lid is to kind of basically open Pandora's box. And it's not really. It's the idea that to open the lid is to trust that the creative impulse has a way that it's going to guide you through and is going to get you through from story to story to story. And that your job is to go into that tunnel of silence as best you can, and to trust that as you're running through that tunnel of silence and you're keeping the pen moving no matter what, and you're writing into the heart of it, you're going towards the knot, as Margaret Atwood says, that you're building your courage, you're building your muscle, you're building your permission. And those three are for me the foundation stones: the permission and the muscle and the courage. And that takes practice and practice and practice. And this is what Peg Sayers, the storyteller from the peninsula next to mine, this is what she did. She practiced her storytelling all through her life. She told the same story time and time and time again. And each time she added a new gesture, or she added a new little curlicue to it, or she added a new little wink or a new little toss of the thumb. Something will get added. You trust that if you keep practicing, that you will also learn to know when you're coming into the cusp where that story is turning and it's going through the washboard of consciousness and it's grabbing onto the meaning and coming out the other side. But you have to keep the pen moving. I say to my writers, write like the clappers. I say it every single week, write like the clappers, because I want them to write faster than their logical mind can actually get in control of. Because when you write faster, guess where you're writing from? You're writing from your intuitive, imaginative, associative brain that's making leaps of imagination. And from those leaps of imagination, you're being surprised. You're going, oh, look at that image. And oh my God, there's a metaphor. You couldn't have made that metaphor happen if you tried from your left brain, but from your right brain, of course you can. Of course you can. Because that's where the creative impulse lives. So it takes this practice, but it also takes this courage to do it again and again and again until you start to really realize that there's a pulse in every single story, and you will know it. I know it myself now. I know I had to write an essay recently that got picked up by Bryant Literary Review, but I spent months going back into the tunnel, going, I'm not quite at that cusp yet. I'm not quite at the meaning and bringing it out the other side. I'm almost there. And I trusted where it started. I trusted what was coming through. So what's the price of not going through that tunnel of silence? For me, it's the untold story. It's the bearing an untold story inside you. There's no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you. But here's the thing that happens to writers too. They kind of say, well, look, not every story is meant to be told, and who wants to be hearing my sob and all of that? And I say, listen, the only thing worth writing about is the human heart in conflict with itself. You have to. recognize that we're all constantly living this metamorphosis. It's constantly going on, this change. We're taking in the raw material of our life, we're bringing it through the cusp of consciousness, and we're bringing it back out changed, informed, in some new form. This is what we're doing. And in doing that, what we're doing is we're saying to someone else, look, here's this flash of insight. Here's this flash. I worked hard to get this flash for you, but here it is now, and I hope you benefit from it. This is where the storyteller and the story come together. This is our job. Our job isn't to keep them. Our job is to give them away. Because really, isn't this why we are doing what we do? Isn't this why we go after that creative impulse? Isn't this the creative impulse itself? Isn't it an offering from life to you and through you to become, and to become again, and then to become again? And so for me, the mechanics of it, then it gets down to the nitty-gritty, and I'll finish here then. What I say to the writers is keep your hand moving. Don't pause to reread the line you've just written. That's stalling and trying to get control of what you're saying. Don't cross out. That's editing. If you write something you didn't mean to write, leave it. I say to them, imagine you're running through this tunnel of silence and you're actually grabbing, oh, look, there's a jumper there and there's a leg of a trousers there and what's the shovel doing here? Don't let your left brain in. Put the shovel down on the page and keep running and keep grabbing what's coming to you. It'll all make sense eventually. Don't worry about spelling, punctuation, grammar. Don't even care about staying within the margins of the lines. I had writers who would come to my class and they would write in spirals. They would turn the page, turn the page, turn the page. And I'm like, they're going to get so dizzy, they'll fall off the chair. But this is what they needed in order to be able to access their material. Lose control. Don't think, don't get logical. Go for the jugular. If something comes up in your writing that's scary or naked, I'm very mercenary in this way. Dive right into it. It probably has lots of energy. And here's the biggest license of all. Feel free to write the worst junk in America. I mean, who wouldn't start writing when you know that you can write whatever you want? Because this is your draft. Now, here's the payoff of all of this for me. What would happen if one woman told the truth about her life? The world would split open. It really would. And for me, and I'll leave you with this thought, as the storyteller in charge of your story, isn't that what we're here to do? To give an offering that makes the road a bit easier for the next fellow traveler. And so I hope today in my talk that that's what I've done, that somehow, in some way, I've made the road a little bit easier for you.
Thank you so much. This was so inspiring. Viva is going to invite questions into the chat, and then she will see, she'll go through the questions for you. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That was absolutely brilliant talk, Ainley. Ainley, by the way, rhymes with mainly. This is the way I learned Ainley's name. And I'm privileged to hear bits of this. It's nice to hear it in whole, but I've been privileged to hear some of this in parts during our writing workshops. And if I can just say a bit about my own experience, I think I walked into Ainley's workshops full of fear and distrust of my own voice, and not really, just wanting to cross things out and edit more than write, and just not completely actually lost as to where the memoir that I'm working on is going to go. And the last thing that Ainley said is, when you're running through the tunnel and you're finding a jumper and a leg of a trouser and you're finding a shovel, just keep it all in and it will make sense eventually. And maybe it won't in the timeline that you're working on, some bits of it, but most of it does make sense. And it's kind of mind-blowing in how the patterns emerge later on. So anyway, that's absolutely great summary of everything that you've been teaching us, Ainley, and encourage people to come and experience it or do it yourself. I mean, I think there are probably other teachers as well. This is not meant to be a sales pitch for Ainley's workshop, but anyway, if anyone has any questions, Vanessa wants to know, can you share some online resources we can access to learn more about this approach? Indy, if you know.
Yes, so the AWA method, you can go to the AWA website and they have their own. The additional parts of it that I bring in through my own Write the Soul Awake philosophy, you can go to my own website and I'll just put it here, and you can find information there as well about kind of the way I bring it together in my own pedagogy. But the AWA, I'll see if I can send Vibha a website, and maybe you can send it out as well then, Vibha?
Sure, absolutely. I can either put it here or I can send it to Jerry, who can deploy it.
Might have gotten it. I'm not sure. You can check and see if that's the right one.
Oh, look at that. Audrey's on top of things here. writingourselveswhole.org, and then about AWA method. That sounds like it should be the right link. Carol wants to know, can you speak to when one has the idea but needs to edit, yet keep the channels open?
Absolutely. So what I would say is the, can you repeat the question, Vibha, one more time, just so that I can make sure I answer it? Oh, yes.
Sure. It says, can you speak to when one has the idea but needs to edit, yet keep the channels open?
So what I would say to that is that when a story or when an idea is first coming to life, the last thing you want to do is to start with the left brain, the analytical brain. What you really want to do with the idea, and so this is what I do when I'm first writing a story, is I allow everything to come out on the page. And that's the first draft. But then after that first draft, what you then do is you make friends with the left brain. You make friends with the editor part of your brain. You start with the intuitive, imaginative, associative, creative part of your brain. You get that first draft down, and then you engage with the revision part of the brain, which is the left brain, that is going to come in and help you and bring to bear the tools that you have picked up through your time in other writing classes to decide how am I going to give this form now? Because the creative impulse of the piece will be alive. And now you just want to know what's the best shape to bring that to life in such a way that I deliver this in a beautiful package to somebody. Does that help?
I thought it was a great answer. Let's see, let's move on to the next question. Tim Flood is asking, please speak about the applicability of your technique with memoir as it applies to fiction, which also comes from the untold story within. To me, memoir and fiction come from the same creative impulse within the same story.
I love this question because I think that everything that we write in the writing classes as they happen is we treat it as fiction. I have studied fiction myself for many years, and I was just reading your question again, Tim. They actually do come from the exact same creative impulse. And a lot of times, in actual fact, truth has, and a lot of people say this, that in a funny kind of way, you can almost tell more truth in fiction than you can in nonfiction, and that sometimes it's an easier way to access your truth. But regardless of whether you're writing fiction or nonfiction, what you're doing is you're doing the exact same thing. Is you're creating a narrator on the page. You're deciding, is that narrator first, second, or third? You're deciding what the point of view is. You're deciding what the scope is. You're deciding who the characters are. You're deciding all of the terrain of the story, regardless of whether it's fiction or nonfiction. And what I'm trying to do is I'm really trying to allow you, in that kind of childish way, to allow your imagination to run free in the landscape that's announcing itself, so that when you come back to the revision and the editing, you'll be able to decide which parts of the puzzle fit for this particular story. And maybe you've got beautiful scenes that belong somewhere else, but it does apply across the board to fiction and nonfiction writers, this method. And we speak to everything as fiction in the classes anyway, because we're speaking to the narrators.
Right, right. And that has the added benefit of, in my experience, of sort of removing that sort of personal attachment and protectiveness, or, makes you a little more impervious to injury. Not that there's any actually negative treatment of the work you've written in these classes ever. So there's an interesting comment from David Strom. Unlike real life, fiction has to make sense.
Exactly.
Yeah. Tim has another question. Can you brainstorm with us what it means to complete a story? How do you know what's within you is all out, or all the out?
That's a great question, Tim. And I think as writers, we always struggle with this. And I think for me, I have this sense, and it's something that I've been practicing and getting better at and improving over the years, is recognizing that a story can have many iterations. I'm reminded of Sharon Olds, who writes a lot of poetry about her father, and seemingly at one point she went to her editor and he said, listen, we need poetry that's not about your father. And she said, all right. And then she sent him her next book and it was all about her father. And so the reality is that the stories we have to tell, we come with certain stories, all of us, and we're going to find many different ways to tell that story. I think sometimes what happens to us is we think we have to tell it all in one story. And so what I say is, no, you don't. You can actually come at it as many ways as you like. You just have to figure out, what is it I want to tell in this particular story? Why am I sharing this particular story? And in that way, you bring it down to that flash of insight that belongs only in this story, and all the things that best serve that flash of insight for that story. And if you have a particular way of telling it, you know yourself when you're sitting down to tell someone something that's happened to you, you know exactly, listen, I want to tell you this great thing that happened to me. And you've it all framed in your mind. I'm going to tell them that this is when I started, and this is what happened, and then this is where it ended up. And would you believe? And you arrive at your flash of insight. That's, for me, I start to trust more that it's okay to tell the story one way, put it down, and then look at it and go, well, that was one way, but now there's still that little thing in the washboard of my consciousness that's saying, there's another message here. And so I go back in again and I decide, and I come at it a different way. Because a lot of times I'm writing the exact same story over and over, but from different approaches. And I'm always bringing to it something new, because I keep changing. How I write about something today is not how I would have written about it 6 months ago, or 6 days ago sometimes. I hope that helps.
Yeah. Kind of, let's see. Jerry's just reminding us that we need to wrap up by 12. So before I forget, Ainley, will you be sharing the slides, or would that be something you're okay doing? Actually sending out the slides to the club? Or is that something that you
I can
do that? Okay, so
Instead of having her trying to do that, can we get them on your website?
that's a perfect idea. Let's do that. I'll put it on my website.
Great.
Jill, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes.
yeah.
Is it already noon? Do we
Any-
have time for one more question, Viva?
Yes, we do.
Oh, good.
Jump
Do
in.
you want me to find it? Oh, let me see.
I think I've got all the questions. Of course, if people are like me, they'll think of the questions exactly at 12:01.
Isn't that always the way?
Yeah.
But what you were just saying though, Ainley, about, you know, how there's so many stories and you can visit them from different angles and all this, it's kind of this infinite treasure trove. It kind of reminded me of this, what I heard Jhumpa Lahiri say once in a conversation I was able to attend. She said, anybody who's lived to be 5 years old has stories to tell for a lifetime. And it was so true. It was so validating,
Yes.
because this was 15 years ago when you could attend a talk with just 30 people in Jhumpa Lahiri. And to know that, you know, it's you have enough stories in you and they're all legitimate and worthwhile. Yeah.
Exactly.
There is another question.
Oh, good. Thank you. Thank you, Tim, for reminding me to look at that. Oh, very good question. Carol is asking, do you want to talk more about using breath?
You know, I'll talk briefly about it because I hear Jerry has said that there's a noontime wrap up. So thank you for that question, Carol. And for me, the breath is the way we land back in to the lived skin of the moment that we're in. So much of the time for me as a trauma survivor, I lived outside of myself and I lived outside of my body and I lived outside of my stories. And I had to find a method to come back to myself and to come back in so that I could be the vessel for the story. Alice Walker says, you know, we're really, all of us are holding up microphones to our ancestors and we're speaking for them. And so this is our job. Our job is to kind of come into the lived skin of our experience. And from that place, then in that grounded place where we're grounded in our bodies, grounded in the breath, grounded in the reality, that story is inbuilt into breath. And I didn't realize this until I was walking around the streets of Alameda yesterday evening, and I was like, oh my gosh, story itself, the creative impulse itself is in every breath. And so if we just connect to the breath, we are connecting to the creative impulse, and we are connecting to the arc of story, taking in the raw material, moving it through the washboard of consciousness, and sending it out into the world in a form that we can then pass along that form and say to someone else, look, here's my poem, or here's my flash fiction, here's my flash of insight that I discovered. And I hope that that helps you too. And it becomes a way that it's informed, and now we're allowing someone else maybe to become informed by it. And so I always start my classes with breath. It seems like the natural place to begin.
That's fabulous. So inspiring. Absolutely. And permission, you know, you've given us to tell our true stories. Really inspiring. So glad. Viva, thank you for bringing her to us. Viva's the one who connected us to you. Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. So business, we hope to see some of you in December at our welcome back party. And then in January on the 15th, our other speaker creating a series for Netflix and other streaming services with Alejandra Adams. I want to thank you. And enough. I think everybody here is just truly, truly, truly inspired. I feel like I'm gonna, you know, have permission now to go start writing more that I didn't think I had permission to before, but you've given me that permission. So thank you so much for everything. And thank you all for being here. And you can find her slides on her website. Thank you for that. And have a good rest of the day, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Viva. Thank you,
so
Jerry.
much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jerry, everyone.
Loved
Thank
it.
you,
Ainley,
Viva.
of course. Thank you.
Yes.
Loved it.
Bye.